Snow covers the dead in thin crusts, where wind has packed it against their field-gray coats. A German sergeant lies face down 53 yards from the nearest American foxhole, his right arm extended toward a Mauser that frost has welded to the frozen earth. Behind him, in a ragged line stretching back toward the tree line, 11 more Feldgrau bodies mark the high water point of an assault that never reached its objective. The pines on both sides of the position look wrong. Bark stripped in vertical slashes, branches hanging at angles that suggest violence rather than weather. Embedded in one trunk, at roughly chest height, sits a curved fragment of steel still warm enough to have melted a small crater into the wood around it. The fragment is American. So is the one buried in the German sergeant's back. Morning light reveals the geometry of what happened here. Mortar craters pock the snow in overlapping circles, their edges already softening under fresh powder. The pattern tells a story that doesn't make sense on first reading. The craters cluster not in front of the American line, not behind the German assault wave, but directly on top of both. Shell fragments lie scattered across the foxholes themselves. One crater sits close enough to a fighting position that its lip has partially collapsed the hole's forward edge. The men who occupied that foxhole are still alive. The Germans who were advancing toward it are not. An after-action report filed 3 days later uses language that belongs in an accident investigation, not a tactical summary. Mortar fire was adjusted to within 50 yards of friendly positions, the document reads. Personnel in forward foxholes reported fragments passing overhead and impacting within arm's reach of their positions. The officer who signed the report added a handwritten note in the margin, 3 words that would have ended careers in any army that had the luxury of court-martials that winter. Requested by infantry. This wasn't a fire mission gone wrong. The men in those foxholes asked for shells to land on top of them. Elsenborn Ridge sits at the northern shoulder of what newspapers would call the Bulge, the salient Hitler's Ardennes offensive, punched into American lines in December 1944. The ridge itself is unremarkable terrain, a gentle rise covered in second-growth timber that wouldn't merit a name on most maps, but the ridge controls the road network behind it, and the road network leads to Liège, and Liège holds fuel dumps the German army desperately needs. Sepp Dietrich's Sixth Panzer Army threw division after division at this ground, and division after division bled out in the snow trying to take it. The Germans expected the Americans to break. Every piece of intelligence suggested they would. The Ardennes offensive achieved total surprise, crashing into green divisions and exhausted units pulled off the line to rest. Across the front, American positions collapsed in hours. Entire regiments surrendered. The road to Antwerp looked open. At Elsenborn Ridge, something different happened. American mortar crews dropped high-explosive rounds close enough to their own positions that the blast concussion knocked helmets off their comrades' heads. They did it deliberately, and they kept doing it for 3 straight days. They did it because the alternative was being overrun, and being overrun meant the Germans would have a clear path to objectives that could change the course of the war in the West. Every year, there are fewer men left who remember what it felt like to hear American shells whistling in and know they were aimed at your own coordinates. The frozen ground at Elsenborn Ridge holds secrets that took decades to piece together. The official histories mention the fighting in broad strokes, brave defense, heavy casualties, successful holding action. They don't explain how a handful of mortar crews broke every rule in the fire support manual and won. The Germans who survived the ridge would later describe the American artillery as something they had never encountered before. They had expected the volume, and American accuracy was already known to be good. What they hadn't anticipated was how close to their own infantry the Americans were willing to drop it. Sepp Dietrich slams his fist on the map table hard enough to knock a coffee cup sideways. The cup shatters on the floor of his command post, and nobody moves to clean it up. Dietrich commands the 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's favorite formation, loaded with the best tanks and the most fanatical troops the Reich can still field. His mission is simple in concept and impossible in execution. Punch through the American line, cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two. The Führer himself has promised that this offensive will reverse the war's momentum. And Dietrich cannot get his lead elements past a forgettable piece of high ground that his intelligence officers had dismissed as lightly defended. The problem is geometry. Hitler's Ardennes plan depended on speed. German armor racing west before the Americans could recover from the initial shock and before Allied air power could intervene. The plan gave Dietrich the northern routes because they offered the best roads, but those roads ran through choke points, and the most critical choke point was the ground around Elsenborn Ridge. Capture the ridge, and the 6th Panzer Army could swing northwest toward its objectives. Fail to capture it, and the entire northern prong of the offensive would grind to a halt in terrain that favored defenders. Dietrich failed to capture it. The Foreign Military Studies series, those post-war reports where German commanders explain their defeats to American Army historians, contains assessments of Elsenborn that read like confessions extracted under duress. General der Infanterie, Günther Blumentritt, who served as chief of staff to the German commander in the West, later wrote that the American stand on the northern shoulder made the further conduct of the offensive impossible. His phrasing is clinical, the way defeated generals learn to write when explaining to their conquerors why they lost. But the meaning is unambiguous. Elsenborn Ridge didn't just slow the German offensive, it killed it. Why did this matter more than Bastogne? The answer lies in what each position controlled. Bastogne sat at a road junction in the center of the Bulge, a logistics hub that became a symbol after McAuliffe's famous Nuts reply to a German surrender demand, earned 1,000 newspaper headlines. The 101st Airborne's defense there was heroic, but Bastogne could be bypassed. German units flowed around it and continued west. The siege tied down American paratroopers and German infantry alike, but it didn't physically block the German advance. Elsenborn Ridge was different. The terrain north of the ridge channeled movement into corridors that American artillery could dominate. The terrain south of the ridge belonged to the 5th Panzer Army, a separate formation with separate objectives. Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army had exactly one path forward, and that path ran through ground. The Americans refused to surrender. The ridge's importance becomes clearer when you trace what happened to units that never got past it. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, teenagers who had been indoctrinated since childhood to believe themselves racially superior soldiers, spent days bleeding out against American positions they couldn't crack. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division attacked the ridge repeatedly and accomplished nothing except filling the snow with German dead. The 3rd Parachute Division, supposedly elite troops, failed so completely that their commander's after-action report reads like a catalogue of excuses. Every formation Dietrich threw at Elsenborn Ridge came back shattered, and every day they spent trying was a day the broader offensive lost momentum. By the time German commanders accepted that the northern shoulder would not break, American reinforcements were already moving into position. Allied aircraft were returning to the skies, and the window for a decisive German victory had closed. The men who held that ground didn't know any of this at the time. They were outnumbered, with German armor somewhere behind the infantry waves. Units on either side of them had been pushed back or overrun. They were holding a shoulder that jutted forward into enemy-controlled territory. What they couldn't know was that their refusal to break was making the entire German operation geometrically impossible. That every hour they held was an hour the offensive bled momentum it could never recover. What did the Germans think they were attacking? The answer matters because the Sixth Panzer Army's entire assault plan rested on assumptions about what waited on the other side of the snowline. German intelligence had done its homework. The Abwehr identified the American units holding the Ardennes sector as either fresh divisions with no combat experience or burned-out formations pulled off the line to recover. The 99th Infantry Division fell into the first category. Activated in November 1942, the division had spent 2 years training in the United States before shipping to Europe. It reached the front lines in early November 1944, barely 6 weeks before Hitler's offensive began. The division's soldiers had never heard a shot fired in anger. Its officers had never coordinated under actual enemy fire. On paper, the 99th looked like exactly what the German High Command needed, a fragile formation that would shatter on first contact. The assessment contained a critical blind spot. German intelligence evaluated American divisions the way they evaluated their own, as collections of riflemen supported by various attached weapons. What they failed to grasp was how differently the American Army thought about fire support. The Wehrmacht organized its heavy weapons under divisional or corps control, parceling them out to infantry units when commanders decided the situation warranted it. The American system pushed firepower down to the lowest levels and expected small unit leaders to call for it on their own initiative. A German infantry company advancing on an American position faced not just the rifles and machine guns in front of it. It faced a fire support network that could concentrate mortar and artillery fire within minutes of a forward observer's radio call. The 99/Div might have been green, but its mortar crews had spent 2 years doing nothing but train. 2 years of repetition had given them an intimacy with their weapons that no manual could substitute. Range tables memorized. Fire adjustment by sound alone when visibility dropped to nothing. They had never killed anyone, but they had fired tens of thousands of practice rounds under every condition the Army training system could simulate. German doctrine called for rapid assault through weak points, accepting casualties to achieve penetration before defenders could organize a response. This approach had shattered armies across Europe. It assumed that green troops would panic, that fire support would arrive too slowly to matter, that momentum would carry German infantry through the initial resistance. Against the Americans at Elsenborn, every assumption failed. The 81mm mortar sits at the heart of this story. The M1 mortar weighed 136 pounds, broken down into 3 loads: baseplate, tube, bipod. A trained crew could set it up in under a minute and drop the first round downrange moments later. Maximum range ran to about 3,000 yards. Minimum range, the closest you could safely drop a round, was supposed to be somewhere around 200 yards, depending on terrain and how much you trusted your calculations. The mortar fired a high-explosive shell that weighed just under 7 pounds and burst into fragments designed to scythe through infantry in the open. What made American mortar crews different wasn't the equipment. The Germans had equivalent weapons. The difference was communications and training. American forward observers carried radios that let them talk directly to mortar positions. They could see the enemy, estimate range and direction, and call corrections in real time. German mortar crews typically worked from pre-planned fire missions or responded to runners carrying written messages. The time gap between spotting a target and hitting it could stretch to 15 minutes or longer. At Elsenborn, American time gaps measured in seconds. A forward observer in a foxhole would see German infantry emerge from the tree line, key his radio, and call the mission. Back at the mortar position, crews would adjust their tubes, confirm the coordinates, and begin firing. The first rounds would be in the air before German soldiers had covered 100 yards. Corrections would follow almost immediately. Drop 50, fire for effect, and the beaten zone would shift onto the advancing formation with mechanical precision. German commanders had trained their men to expect American firepower. What they had not trained them to expect was firepower that arrived before an assault could build momentum, that tracked their movements across open ground and seemed to anticipate where they were going rather than react to where they had been. 50 yards. The distance from a mortar crew's plotted aim point to the foxholes they were trying to protect. A fit man can cover it in about 7 seconds at a dead sprint. At this range, the difference between saving your comrades and killing them comes down to fractions of a degree on an elevation crank. The M1 mortar's tube sits at an angle determined by 2 factors: range and charge. Drop a round down the tube, and propellant gases slam the projectile upward along a ballistic arc. The steeper the angle, the shorter the range and the higher the apex. At maximum elevation, nearly vertical, the round climbs almost straight up, hangs for a moment at the top of its arc, then plunges earthward at a near vertical angle. This high trajectory is what makes mortars useful in broken terrain. Shells clear trees and ridgelines that would stop flat trajectory weapons cold. It also makes close-range fire geometrically terrifying. A mortar round aimed at a target 200 yards away follows a relatively shallow arc. The shell's descent angle at impact might be 45 degrees or less. Miss your aim point by 10 yards, and the round lands 10 yards off target. Predictable, manageable. Now shrink the range to 50 yards. The tube cranks nearly vertical. The round goes almost straight up, pauses, falls almost straight down. The descent angle approaches 90 degrees. That same 10-yard miss now depends on factors the crew cannot control. A gust of wind, a slight wobble as the round leaves the tube, variation between propellant batches, the base plate shifting on frozen ground. The beaten zone contracts to a point. Either you hit the target, or you hit something very close to the target. At 50 yards, Very close might be an American foxhole. The base plate creates another problem. In training, mortar crews set their weapons on packed earth or sand that absorbed recoil and held the plate steady. The Ardennes in December offered frozen ground that rang like iron when a spade struck it. Dig a shallow pit for the base plate, and you hit frost layer before you hit anything that would grip. Fire around, and the recoil drives the plate backward rather than down. The tube's angle shifts. The next round lands somewhere the crew didn't intend. On normal fire missions, this drift gets corrected between shots. At danger-close ranges, that correction might arrive too late. The cold itself attacked the weapon. Lubricants thickened. The elevation mechanism's gear teeth moved in microscopic jerks rather than smooth increments. A quarter turn of the crank that should have adjusted range by 25 yards might adjust it by 30 or 20 or somewhere in between. Crews learned to work the mechanism constantly, keeping it loose, but the margin for error shrank with every round. German infantry closed faster than anyone had planned for. The assault tactics that had conquered France relied on shock and forward momentum. German soldiers advanced in short rushes, hitting the ground when fire intensified, rising to rush forward again when it slackened. The approach created a problem for mortar crews trying to break the attack. By the time an observer called a fire mission and rounds began falling, the leading German soldiers had already covered another 50 or 60 yards. Adjust fire forward, and by the time the correction landed, they had moved again. The beaten zone always seemed to arrive where the Germans had been, not where they were. The solution, the only solution that worked, was to stop adjusting forward. Call the fire onto your own position and let the Germans walk into it. This required something close to insanity. The forward observer needed his mortar crews to place rounds within a margin of error smaller than the manual said was possible. The mortar crews needed the observer's coordinates to be exact. Riflemen in the foxholes needed both to be right, and everyone needed the enemy assault to keep advancing into the beaten zone rather than going to ground or pulling back. Cordite and pine resin mixed in the frozen air. Concussion waves pressed against eardrums, even through the frozen earth, and snow jumped off tree branches with each impact, cascading down in sheets that mixed with the smoke and the screams. German soldiers who had pushed through artillery barrages across the Eastern Front found something different here. The shells didn't land behind them, trying to catch them in the open. The shells landed on the American positions themselves and simply kept landing there, a curtain of steel fragments that made the last 50 yards impassable. The wire held for exactly 11 seconds longer than it should have. Volksgrenadier assault teams carried wire cutters as standard equipment, but the frozen concertina had become brittle in ways that worked against them. Metal that should have parted cleanly under the cutter's jaws shattered instead, spraying fragments that sliced through wool gloves and exposed skin. The delay was insignificant in tactical terms, a few heartbeats, nothing more, but it compressed the German assault into a dense mass at precisely the moment American riflemen needed targets they couldn't miss. Rifle fire alone wasn't going to stop them. The men in the foxholes understood this with the clarity that comes from watching an assault build momentum despite everything you throw at it. German infantry absorbed casualties the way a sponge absorbs water. Individuals fell, but the mass kept coming, filling the gaps left by the dead with bodies that hadn't been hit yet. The Volksgrenadier divisions attacking Elsenborn Ridge had been rebuilt from the remnants of shattered formations, their ranks filled with men too young or too old for the Wehrmacht's traditional standards, but they advanced with a discipline that their training shouldn't have produced. They had been told that breaking through here would end the war. Some of them believed it. The forward observer's radio crackled with a request that mortar crews had been dreading since the assault began. The coordinates he called matched his own position, not 50 yards forward or danger close to my location. The coordinates placed the beaten zone directly on the American Foxholes, with the expectation that German soldiers would be standing in it when the rounds arrived. A German NCO captured 2 days later described what happened next. The interrogation report, one of thousands processed through V-Corps intelligence during the battle, contains his account of watching mortar rounds descend from nearly straight overhead. "We thought they had made a mistake," he said. "The shells were landing on their own men. We kept advancing because we thought they were killing themselves." The transcript notes that the prisoner paused here and the interrogator waited. They were not making a mistake. The geometry that made danger-close fire terrifying also made it devastatingly effective against troops caught in the open. Rounds plunging at near vertical angles burst above the frozen ground rather than burying themselves before detonation. Fragments sprayed outward and downward in patterns that scythed through standing men while passing over soldiers pressed flat in foxholes. The Americans had cover. The Germans did not. The mathematical difference between a man standing upright and a man lying in a hole 3 feet deep was the difference between catching 100 fragments and catching none. German assault doctrine assumed that closing with the enemy would reduce casualties by ending the exposure to fire. Get inside the defender's beaten zone, and his supporting weapons become useless. He cannot shell his own position without killing his own men. This assumption had held true against every army the Wehrmacht had faced. It did not hold true at Elsenborn Ridge. The Americans had calculated the angles and accepted the risk. They concluded that losing men to their own fire was preferable to being overrun. The Volksgrenadiers who survived the first salvo went to ground instinctively, seeking cover that didn't exist. Pressed flat against frozen earth that offered no protection from above, they discovered that the fire wasn't stopping. Round after round dropped into the same narrow band of terrain, each burst scattering fragments across men who had nowhere to go. Rising meant death, whether they retreated or advanced. Staying prone meant waiting for the next round to land close enough to kill. The assault broke apart in the space of 90 seconds. German soldiers who had survived Soviet artillery and British machine guns at Normandy, who had held against overwhelming American firepower for months. These men crawled backward through their own dead rather than continue forward. Not because they lacked courage, because courage had ceased to matter. The Americans had created a killing ground that required no courage to defend, only the willingness to accept that some of your own men might die alongside the enemy. The elevation wheel is cold enough to burn skin through leather gloves. Sergeant Earl Wibben grips it anyway, feeling the gear teeth catch and release as he cranks the tube toward vertical. Each click walks the impact point 25 yards closer to the foxholes, where men he knows by name are pressed against frozen earth, waiting for German infantry to reach them, or American steel to fall short. The base plate has shifted again. Wibben can feel it through the vibration pattern when rounds leave the tube. A slight wobble that wasn't there an hour ago. The frozen ground won't hold the plate steady no matter how deep they dig. Every shot drives it backward a fraction of an inch, and every fraction changes where the next round lands. His assistant gunner is on his knees behind the plate, pressing his weight against it, trying to anchor 60 pounds of stamped steel with 160 pounds of Wisconsin farm boy. Drop 50. Fire for effect. The voice on the radio belongs to Lieutenant Morrison. Wibben has never met him. Morrison is somewhere in the tree line 400 yards forward, watching Germans advance through snow that comes up to their knees in places. The coordinates he's calling would put rounds close enough for Morrison to hear fragments whistle past his foxhole. Close enough that the margin between killing Germans and killing Morrison has shrunk to the width of a compass needle. Wibben makes the adjustment. His hands know the mathematics, even when his mind refuses to engage with them. 11 clicks counterclockwise, charge reduced to minimum. The tube now points at an angle that looks nearly straight up, the kind of angle that training manuals describe in theoretical terms, because no sane crew would fire at this range under normal circumstances. The M1 mortar's firing pin sits at the bottom of the tube, fixed in place. Drop a round, and gravity does the rest. The shell slides down, strikes the pin, and the propellant charge ignites. There's no trigger, no moment of deliberate choice. You commit when you release the round. What happens after that belongs to physics. Hanging. The round slides down the tube. A hollow thump, felt more than heard. The shell climbs into gray December sky and disappears. 3 seconds. That's how long the round hangs at the top of its arc before gravity reclaims it. Wibben counts them the way a man counts heartbeats during a heart attack, aware that counting changes nothing, unable to stop. The explosion comes from much closer than it should, close enough that snow shakes loose from the branches overhead and sifts down onto the mortar pit. Close enough that Wibben's assistant gunner flinches backward from the base plate before catching himself. On target. Fire for effect. The words carry no emotion. Morrison might be reading a grocery list. Wibben feeds another round into the tube, then another, then another. The rhythm becomes mechanical. Round, thump, count, explosion, round. Somewhere forward, German soldiers are dying in the beaten zone that Morrison has placed exactly where he wants it. Somewhere forward, American soldiers are pressing themselves into frozen earth and hoping the mathematics hold. The German word for mortar is Granatwerfer, literally grenade thrower. The term predates the First World War and reflects an era when these weapons lobbed explosives at ranges measured in tens of yards rather than thousands. Something almost quaint about the etymology, given what the weapons became. Wibben's hands are shaking, not from cold. The exertion of rapid fire has warmed him despite the temperature. The tremor comes from somewhere deeper, from the place where calculation meets consequence. He knows what a mortar round does to human tissue, knows that the men in those foxholes depend on his precision to survive. Precision is a prayer rather than a guarantee. Ceasefire, ceasefire, they're falling back. The words take a moment to register. Wibben's hands continue reaching for the next round before his mind catches up and stops them. The tube still points at that impossible angle, a metal finger aimed at a patch of sky directly above American positions. His assistant gunner is saying something. Wibben can't hear it over the ringing in his ears. He looks at his hands, still gripping the elevation wheel, still ready to make adjustments that aren't needed anymore, and slowly unclenches his fingers. 1743 hours. The first survivors begin filtering back to the Volksgrenadier assembly area, and the reports they carry make no tactical sense. Feldwebel Heinrich Krause reaches the aid station with fragments in his left shoulder and a story that the medical officer initially dismisses as shock-induced confusion. The Americans shelled their own positions, not behind their lines, not in the approach zone, directly on the foxholes where their riflemen were dug in. Krause watched it happen. He was 30 meters from the American wire when the first rounds came down, and he kept advancing because he assumed the enemy had made a catastrophic error. Artillery accidents happen. Miscommunication between forward observers and gun crews. A panicked lieutenant calling fire on the wrong coordinates. The second salvo convinced him otherwise. The rounds landed in the same place, exactly the same place. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, each burst centered on the American defensive line, each burst catching German soldiers who had done exactly what their training demanded. Close with the enemy, get inside his supporting fire, make his artillery useless. The Americans had found a way to make their artillery useful at ranges where it should have been impossible. Krause's account matches 6 others that arrive over the next hour. The details vary in sequence, but converge on the same impossible fact. German commanders at the regimental level read these reports and reached for explanations that fit within their experience. Perhaps the Americans had pre-registered their own positions and were firing blind, accepting casualties as the cost of breaking the assault. Perhaps forward observers had called fire on coordinates they knew were wrong, sacrificing themselves to stop the breakthrough. Neither explanation quite works. Pre-registered fire assumes the defenders knew exactly where the assault would hit and exactly when. It requires coordination between infantry and artillery that exceeded anything German intelligence had credited American units with achieving. Suicide fire by forward observers might explain one incident, but the reports describe sustained barrages lasting minutes, adjusted in real time, walking rounds across terrain as the assault developed. Someone was watching, someone was correcting, and someone was continuing to call fire, even as shells burst within grenade-throwing distance of American foxholes. The interrogation reports that would eventually reach V Corps intelligence contained fragments of these initial German assessments. A captured company commander from the 277th Volksgrenadier Division described the tactical briefing he received after the first day's failed assaults. "We were told the Americans had developed a new doctrine," he said. "They were willing to accept losses we would not accept. They treated their own infantry as expendable if it meant stopping our advance." This interpretation missed the point, but it revealed how completely the tactic had broken German expectations. The Americans weren't treating their infantry as expendable. They were trusting their mortar crews to place rounds with a precision that doctrine said was impossible at these ranges. The risk wasn't reckless, it was calculated. Geometry favored defenders. The near vertical descent angle of close-range mortar fire spread fragments outward rather than downward, and a soldier lying in a foxhole catches fewer fragments than a soldier advancing upright across open ground. German assault doctrine had no counter for this. You cannot close with an enemy who shells his own position. You cannot exploit the dead zone between his defensive line and his supporting weapons because he has eliminated the dead zone entirely. Every assumption about how close-quarters combat worked, assumptions refined across 5 years of war on 3 continents, had been rendered obsolete by Americans willing to drop steel on their own heads. Reports filtering back to Sixth Panzer Army headquarters that evening painted a picture of attacks that had simply dissolved. Not retreated in good order, not been repulsed with heavy casualties, but dissolved, men crawling backward through corpses because forward motion had become physically impossible. The shoulder at Elsenborn Ridge was not bending. The Volksgrenadiers had found the limits of what infantry courage could achieve against an enemy who had stopped playing by recognizable rules. Sepp Dietrich read the reports. The coffee cup someone had replaced on his map table sat untouched, growing cold. His staff waited for orders that would restore momentum to the offensive. The orders never came. There was nothing to order. The men at Elsenborn Ridge had found something the Wehrmacht couldn't answer with doctrine or determination. The German offensive needed Elsenborn Ridge to work, not wanted, needed. The road network behind the American positions fed directly into the routes that would carry Sixth Panzer Army toward the Meuse crossings, and without those roads, Dietrich's armor had nowhere to go. Every hour the ridge held was an hour his tanks burned fuel they couldn't replace, sitting in traffic jams on secondary roads that couldn't handle the volume. The entire northern axis of Operation Wacht am Rhein depended on breaking through a handful of infantry companies who had decided that 50 yards was an acceptable margin for mortar fire. By December 19th, the arithmetic had become impossible to ignore. German staff officers tracking fuel consumption against distance found themselves staring at graphs that pointed nowhere good. The offensive had been designed around a 96-hour timetable, 4 days to reach the Meuse, then exploit the crossing before Allied reserves could respond. Elsenborn Ridge had consumed 3 of those days without yielding a single usable road junction. Dietrich's panzers were burning through their fuel allocation sitting still, waiting for infantry to clear a path that infantry could not clear. The Volksgrenadiers kept attacking because orders demanded it. The ridge kept holding because Americans kept dropping steel on their own positions. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Division during the Ardennes offensive, though his unit operated in the southern sector rather than against Elsenborn directly. His post-war assessment for the Foreign Military Studies series addressed the northern failure with the clinical detachment of a professional discussing a competitor's bankruptcy. The American defense of the Elsenborn shoulder exceeded our estimates of what could be achieved by troops of their experience level, he wrote. Their willingness to accept close-range fires that would have caused unacceptable casualties to our own assault troops, indicated either exceptional training or exceptional desperation. We concluded it was both. The phrase, exceptional desperation, sits oddly in a technical military assessment. Bayerlein was not a man given to colorful language. That he reached for it here suggests the impression the defense made on German professional opinion. The smell of cordite doesn't dissipate in freezing air the way it does in summer. It hangs in the hollows between ridge lines, mixing with wood smoke and the copper-sweet odor that accumulates wherever men have been dying for days. By the time the last major assault broke against the American wire, the air around Elsenborn Ridge carried a weight that veterans would remember decades later. Not the smell of victory, because victory implies an ending, but the smell of something that had stopped moving. The Germans were not retreating. They were simply no longer coming forward. The distinction matters. A retreating enemy can regroup and return. An enemy who has stopped coming forward has made a calculation about cost and benefit and concluded that the cost exceeds anything further attempts could justify. The broader ramifications took weeks to become clear, even to German high command. Without the northern shoulder breaking, the entire shape of the offensive changed. Forces that should have been exploiting a breakthrough found themselves pinned in traffic on roads that couldn't handle them, burning fuel that couldn't be replaced, losing time that couldn't be recovered. The offensive center continued forward. Bastogne, Malmedy, the deep penetration that would give the battle its American name. But the northern arm had been amputated at the shoulder. A one-armed offensive cannot encircle anything. The men who held Elsenborn Ridge didn't know they had changed the outcome of the battle. What they knew was simpler. Another day survived. The Germans no longer coming. The mortar crews behind them, having done something that shouldn't have been possible, and done it over and over until the assault formations dissolved into scattered survivors crawling backward through snow that was no longer white. An after-action report filed by the 99th Infantry Division contains a notation that captures the tone of those final hours. Enemy activity along the ridge decreased significantly after 1,800 hours. Cause unknown at this time. Cause unknown. The men who had broken the last assault didn't file a report explaining what they had done. The German prisoners didn't explain it either. They were still trying to understand how they had failed. The ridge had held. That was the only fact that mattered. 0730 hours, December 20th, 1944. The snow has stopped falling. Weak winter sunlight breaks through the overcast for the first time in 3 days, and what it reveals across the forward slope of Elsenborn Ridge requires trained eyes to read correctly. The craters form a pattern, not random, not scattered, a deliberate geometry that follows the contour of the American defensive line with mechanical precision. Each crater sits within a consistent distance of the foxholes it was meant to protect. The spacing between impact points reflects the burst radius of an 81mm high-explosive round, overlapping just enough to eliminate gaps in the fragmentation pattern. Someone with a clipboard and a surveyor's eye could walk this ground and reconstruct the fire missions from the evidence alone. The German dead tell the same story. They lie in clusters that mark where assault waves stacked up against the curtain of steel, each cluster positioned at almost exactly the same distance from the wire. 50 yards, 60. The bodies closest to the American positions are scattered rather than grouped. Men who made it through the beaten zone individually, picked off by rifle fire because there weren't enough of them left to constitute a threat. The mortar fire had done its work before the riflemen needed to do theirs. Random fire sprayed in every direction, hoping something connects. That's desperation. What happened at Elsenborn Ridge was the opposite. calculated risk executed with a precision that German commanders refused to believe was possible until the evidence lay frozen in front of them. The mortar crews had found the exact intersection of close enough to kill and far enough to survive, and they had threaded that needle over and over across 3 days of continuous assault. The after-action reports that would filter up through V Corps and First Army over the following weeks struggled to capture what had actually occurred. Doctrine didn't have vocabulary for what the mortar crews had done. The field manuals specified minimum safe distances for supporting fires, and those distances existed for good reason. Fragmentation doesn't discriminate between friendly and enemy soldiers, but the manuals assumed conventional defensive situations, where infantry would fall back if pressed too hard, where supporting weapons would shift their fire to avoid endangering their own men. The men at Elsenborn Ridge had discarded those assumptions. They had trusted their mortar crews to place rounds with a precision that training said was impossible, and the mortar crews had delivered. The position still existed to defend because the crews had been willing to risk destroying it. Sergeant Earl Wibben's hands would shake for 3 more days. The tremor became noticeable enough that his company commander asked if he needed to rotate to the rear. Wibben refused. The Germans might come again. The tube still worked. His hands could still turn the elevation wheel, and turning the wheel was what mattered. 7 men from the rifle companies forward of Wibben's position died during the 3 days of close-range mortar support. The records don't specify how many died from German fire and how many from American. The distinction may have seemed important to someone compiling statistics in a headquarters building far from the ridge. It didn't seem important to the men who survived. A letter written by Private First Class Thomas Henning of the 394th Infantry Regiment reached his family in Ohio 6 weeks after the battle. Henning had spent most of December 18th lying in a foxhole while mortar rounds burst close enough to shower him with frozen dirt and metal fragments. The letter doesn't mention fear, doesn't mention the German assault, doesn't mention the bodies that littered the ground in front of his position when the firing stopped. "The mortar boys saved us," he wrote. "I don't know how they did it. I don't want to know. But they dropped those rounds right on top of us, and somehow we're still here, and the Germans aren't. I'm going to find those guys when this is over and buy them a drink. I'm going to buy them a lot of drinks." Henning survived the war. The records don't say whether he ever found them.